Okay, we are going to get started. We are supposed to have a bunch of pastors who are participating in a conference today show up. They are running behind schedule, but we need to get going because our guest speaker today is on a fairly tight schedule. So I'm just going to ask Madison and Caleb to come up. Madison is going to lead us in prayer and the Pledge of Allegiance, and then Caleb will introduce our guest speaker.
Would you please bow your heads for prayer? Lord, thank you for this opportunity for us to gather together and learn how to be a light in politics. I pray that you'll be with our speaker today. Give him wisdom and insight as he speaks. I also pray that you will open our hearts and minds to draw closer to you from this presentation. Bless our conversation today. In your name we pray. Amen. And then please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
It is my honor to introduce today's speaker. Tim Goeglein is the Vice President for External and Government Relations at Focus on the Family in Washington, D.C. He has served in high-level government positions for over 2 decades, including as Special Assistant to President George W. Bush. In this role, he was the President's principal outreach contact for conservatives, think tanks, veteran groups, faith-based groups, and other leading cultural organizations. He has also served as a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation and a professor of government at Liberty University. Goeglein is also the author of several books, including his most recent, Stumbling Towards Utopia, How the 1960s Turned into a National Nightmare and How to Revive the American Dream. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Tim Goeglein.
Thank you. Caleb, thank you, and for that mercifully short introduction. I was speaking at Johns Hopkins University a week ago today, and the young woman who introduced me is very enthusiastic for Focus on the Family, especially Adventures in Odyssey, and the introduction was about 10 minutes. I thought, my heavens, I should say thank you and good night, you know. By the way, it is really an honor to be back with my friend Greg. We have been friends and connected through 4 iterations. And I didn't know until about 90 seconds ago that another friend, we were both press secretaries and communications directors in the U.S. Senate at the same time for 2 U.S. senators who essentially were best friends at the time, Senator Connie Mack of Florida and Senator Dan Coates of Indiana. So it's wonderful to be reunited all these years later. And his name is on the building, and as I was mentioning to Greg, I think this is my 4th visit to Colorado Christian University, but again, attendant to Senator Mack and Senator Coates, both were very good friends with the late, great Senator Bill Armstrong. And I remember very well the very first time we met. I was in his book group in Washington on Capitol Hill for 10 years. And he was truly a remarkable person. And I remember my very first visit here, he said he was coming to build a university. And when I drove on to the campus today, this kind of stellar autumnal day, you know, the blue skies, there's the mountains, the beautiful sunshine, and all of these new buildings, I really praise God for the late, great Senator Bill Armstrong. So in my role at Focus on the Family, I speak at a different college campus about every 2 weeks in the academic year. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Azusa Pacific, CCU, Liberty, Hillsdale, the absolute gamut. And in the last 5 years, if someone said to me, what is the most common requested topic of speech, remarks, panel debate, debated recently in the Yale Political Union, the question has always been the relationship between faith and public life. And by God's grace, I have served for about 10 years, although I'm not a graduate of there, at the University of Pennsylvania Fox Leadership Forum. And there are only 2 evangelicals in this rather remarkable group. And about 3 years ago, I was in a debate with Marcy Hamilton, who is one of the most well-known public intellectuals in our country on the question of faith and political life. Although I'm raising my right hand, I promise you, and I'm betting dollars to donuts even though I'm not a gambling man, that her worldview, and excuse the royal hour, our worldview are very, very different. And the thing that spurred on this narrative when Greg and I were speaking was a comment that she made in our Fox Leadership Forum. And I think it's an appropriate way to begin our time together this afternoon. And I'm quoting Marcy. She said, "The problem, Tim, is that there is far too much religious liberty in the United States." And she said, speaking as her, she said, "My biggest concern is that most people do not understand the great chasm in our country between faith and public life." And she went on to make this rather impassioned defense that in the history of our country, you really are making a mistake if you are infusing or suffusing the idea of religion and faith when we talk about public policy or politics. I fraternally think that she's a great person, and we've become actually quite good friends. But viscerally, I completely disagreed. And it was one of the catalyzing effects that led to the drafting of my 3rd book, which I'm not going to speak about today. But thematically, I thought in light of being at CCU and being at this moment, 10 months into a new presidency, I can't believe we're just 10 months into this presidency, I think that some of the remarks I'd like to offer today, I hope fit in. And I hope to weave into them some part of my own observation after 10 years working in the U.S. Senate, nearly 8 years at the White House, and the last 18 as one of the vice presidents at Focus on the Family, all living and working inside the Beltway. And what I hope to do is to give an honest assessment, progressive, conservative, left, right, whatever we want to say, but to give an honest assessment of how we might at least think about this relationship between faith and public life. And I want to allow plenty of time for dialogue and conversation. And I want to begin my remarks with a man whose name should be on the tip of every Christian's tongue, because in the relatively short history of the United States Supreme Court, and if we're having a discussion about matters of faith, jurisprudentially, and I'm not an attorney, but I think by now, I pray, said with humility, I've read every word that Hugo Black ever wrote, and he was very prolific. And he was part of a minority opinion in a very, what I would say, infamous case of Everson versus Board of Education. And I thought in our time together today, this might be an appropriate way to start. Because in this, and by the way, I would encourage us to look at the way in which he uses the royal we. He says in this very famous opinion that the First Amendment has erected a wall between church and state. That wall must be high and impregnable. He says we could not approve the slightest breach. This is a very interesting, in my opinion, use of the word we. I feel quite confident, and I pray, being very respectful of Hugo Black's reputation and standing on the court, that this is utterly in opposition to the way that our founding fathers and mothers would have in real time, not retrospectively, thought about the idea of the relationship between church and state. And I feel confident that whether you were a Federalist or an anti-federalist, you never in real time would have thought that there was anything even approaching a so-called impregnable wall. By the way, I love the hairdo. That's why I include this photo of Karl Marx. And by the way, I am not, and I want to be very clear, not underscoring it, suggesting that Hugo Black is a Marxist. But in real time, in Communist Manifesto 82, Marx had a very interesting take in light of some of the remarks I'm going to deliver. He says that you take away a nation's heritage and they are more easily persuaded. And what I mean in saying this is that in the last 3 years, I have spoken either as a member of a panel or in a debate format at 7 of the top 10 of our law schools in the United States. And in each of them, I have asked, these are first-year law students, so in all fairness, I've asked them what they think about the Everson opinion and their view of the way the 9 justices delineated this question. And it was the strangest response because in 7 of these law schools, there could not have been more than a true handful of people who knew anything about what I was talking about. That's not an indictment, by the way. We are living in a time, and I say this as an inveterate optimist, but we are living in a time of historic, cultural, and political and legal illiteracy. And the inability, and I would, by the way, I'll extend it if I may, if we were to go to some of the top law schools which have a Christian derivation of first-year law students, I think that we might find the same sort of misunderstanding or no understanding. There are 2 people who I have had the pleasure and privilege of debating several times, and they've both become great friends. Again, I will now use the royal we. We do not share a worldview on essential matters, but I really respect their views, even as I disagree with them. And one of them, I think it's possible that some people in this beautiful room will know these 2 men as 2 leading progressive public intellectuals who feel strongly in opposition to most of the remarks that I would be offering today. And the first is Steve Green, and he is the author of the book Inventing a Christian America. By the way, I love the subtitle. I've learned that in the 21st century, pay attention to subtitles because subtitles almost always tell you what the author assumes is the narrative of his or her book. And the subtitle of Steve's book is The Myth of the Religious Founding. He's the former legal director and special counsel for Americans United for Separation of Church and State. We at Focus on the Family have routinely engaged with them and almost always come down on separate sides of the question. But I was taken in Steve's important book by the following. I wanted to share it with you today at Colorado Christian University. He says, if by the question one is asking, by the way, I'm asking this question, yeah. If by the question one is asking whether the Founding Fathers relied on Protestant Christian principles in drafting the essential documents, he means here the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. I'm sure most of us know that our country is approaching its 250th anniversary. That's the pin that I'm wearing today. And if you're Italian, you don't know when your country was born. If you're French, you don't know. If you're British, if you're English, if you're Spanish, we love them all, but they really don't know when their country was born. But we Americans know with precision what time our country was born and what day, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon on July 4th of 1776. And by the way, overwhelmingly, there were exceptions, definitively. But overwhelmingly, our country was founded by what we would call dissenting Protestant Christians. So if by the question one is asking whether the Founding Fathers relied on Protestant Christian principles in drafting the essential documents and in organizing the new governments, then the answer, I love the use of the word resounding, then the answer is a resounding no. I feel that he could not be more wrong, and I'm quoting John Adams, facts are stubborn things. By the way, another friend is Andy Seidel, again, a name you may know, and he agrees very strongly with Steve, and he is a constitutional attorney who works for the Freedom From Religion Foundation, and I'm quoting Andy. He said, there have been pushes throughout U.S. history to put God into the Constitution. It is a deliberately godless document. Now, in light of what Steve and Andy are asserting, I think we should take a look at the facts. I think this is a reason that Lincoln was such a great litigator. You know, it's not just enough to assert, you have to demonstrate. And I think this is part of the essential idea of Lincoln mastering the 5 books of Euclid. You know, that there is this sense that it's one of the great senators in our era, Daniel Moynihan, famously said, everyone's entitled to his opinions, but not everyone's entitled to his facts. So I think we ought to take a look at the documents themselves. This is, of course, the Declaration. We hold these truths, I'm obviously quoting from the documents, the quote, end quote, godless documents. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights that are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, I was in a debate with Steve, and he modified slightly what he said. He said, you're talking about Jesus. And I said, I've not raised the name of Jesus in this discussion. But I said to him, their Creator, capitalized, I think is unmistakable to the average person in the 18th century or the 21st century, that the principal author, Thomas Jefferson, is definitively speaking about God. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, appealed to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions. There it is, tucked into that second paragraph, the Supreme Judge of the world. I think a reasonable, rational person would say that we are talking about God. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on divine providence, we mutually pledge to reach, forgive me, I was tapping this out quickly. We pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. So, by the way, I know that this is very familiar to students, especially at CCU. But I think it's important, in light of these big assertions, to go back to the document itself and the documents and to say, what are we talking about? And similarly, I want to go back to both Hugo Black and the comments that I mentioned a moment ago. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, this is very interesting to me, that in the 18th century, we know definitively, like with no exception, that the majority of the 13 states or colonies, right? You all know that Rhode Island is left off of the Constitution. They eventually did the ratification, but late. But we all know definitively that more than half, far more than half, had state churches, and they were strongly supported mandatorily by tax dollars. So this idea of a high and impregnable wall is demonstrably flawed. But also, it's very clear in the words that we're not going to have a national religion. We're not going to have a national church. This is not going to be a theocracy. You know that both Adams and Jefferson, very close friends, completely different worldview on very essential matters. Neither was at the Constitutional Convention, by the way. Adams was in London, and Jefferson was in Paris. I'm sure they were texting each other with George Washington to find out how the whole thing was, unfolding. But they made it very clear that they would not, under any circumstance, support ratification without a Bill of Rights. And they both felt passionately that faith and religion had to be a cornerstone. I want to go to another Supreme Court justice. And by the way, I commend in the strongest possible terms to everybody here the life and the work of Joseph Story. You know, in our own time, I know you're having Chris Scalia, who's a great friend. I know you're having him come soon in this speaker series, his late great father. And there are many others, Justice Alito, I'm sure undoubtedly people here know these names. Joseph Story is their peer. He is a peer of the founding generation. And you could, by the way, you could use a lot. You could pull out in context, not out of context, but in context, a number of things that he really brilliantly wrote. Great Supreme Court justice, by the way, the author of the commentaries on the U.S. Constitution, which even to this day remain must reading by all Americans. He has a very eloquent and fluid pen. And he wrote that this is, I think, a very important catechesis for us in the 21st century. He said, the duty of supporting religion, and especially the Christian religion, is very different from the right to force the consciences of other men or to punish them from worshiping God in the matter, which they believe their accountability to him requires. I think this is a thesis statement for the view of religion in public life, not only of the founding generation, but of people at CCU and the rest of our country. This is an honest, I believe, catechesis on faith and public life in the United States by both political parties through time. By the way, I'm not going to take the time today. I wanted to bring it along only because we're on the cusp of Thanksgiving, one of my favorite holidays, probably, hopefully yours. But the Mayflower Compact is something I had heard about for years. I had never read it. But when I was writing the book, I went back and I read the Mayflower Compact, and I read many of the diary entries and letters of the Pilgrim Fathers. I was astonished in the pre-founding, coming through the Narragansett Bay, the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, how essential Christianity and faith is not just to our founding, but to the pre-founding, which, by the way, I think would be worthy of a great book because the material is so rich. Before they ever formally established the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the entire foundation of the way of government going forward was based Christologically. And I want to go to the man, Thomas Flexner, his great biographer called The Indispensable Man, George Washington. On this question of faith in public life, I think it's important to say that as different as our founding fathers and mothers were, and by the way, they disagreed on the biggest things that you can disagree about. Should there be a national army or local state-based militias? Should there be a national currency? Should states or colonies be able to draft and enforce treaties? I could go on and on. Huge differences. One thing they did not disagree upon, and this is, I want to be very careful so that I'm not on thin ice, but one of the things they all agreed on was you could not have ordered liberty and freedom over time without virtue, which is a kind of fancy way of saying moral excellence. Moral excellence, by the way, in the citizenry and in the leaders. And no one believed Washington. And I want to just very, very rapidly, I want to go through his farewell address, which, by the way, I think will be a great speech in 1,000 years. I was taken by how many of the principles I'm asserting today are weaved into this great speech. He said, "It is substantially true that virtue and morality is a necessary spring of popular government. Where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths which are the instruments of the investigation in the courts of justice. By the way, Washington is, look at the date, 1796. We've not been a country very long. The Supreme Court is frankly still sorting out really big matters. And the father of our country is asserting essential foundational truths of the way that you actually construct and think about courts. And let us caution, indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. He says famously, of all the dispositions, by the way, the use of the word all, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In that founding generation, big statement, in that founding generation, if they had asked for a vote, I feel confident, very confident, not hyperbole, not rhetoric, not talking points, that this idea of virtue and freedom, faith and public life would have been overwhelmingly, if not unanimously, confirmed by the founding generations. By the way, I brought this along as well. I don't want to spend time on it. But I was in a debate just a few weeks ago at Yeshiva University in New York. And the debate was fascinating because for a lot of reasons. You've all followed the disputes and the debates at Columbia, Yeshiva, New York University in the Village, St. John's, Fordham, all New York great universities. And this idea of the welcoming nature of people of the Judaic tradition. And I know that there are some here who are very well aware of, but if you're not, I'm begging you to find this remarkable letter from George Washington to the oldest Jewish temple congregation community in our country in Newport, the Hebrew congregation there. It's still a thriving congregation. And they write a letter to Washington saying essentially, are we, as Jews living in America, do we have equal access in the American experience? And by the way, the use by Washington, a lifelong Anglican, was on the vestry of 3 parishes, including Pohick Parish, which is just a few miles from our own front door, which is lovely. We've been there many times. Washington was a very serious Christian. I commend to you Michael Novak's book on George Washington and the idea of his Christianity. But he makes it, and he continually uses biblical imagery over and over in his diaries, in his letters, in his speeches. He loves to use this idea of a man and his family living peaceably under their vine and fig tree. He famously, one of my 10 most famous quotes from George Washington, he said he would rather be a farmer, than an emperor of any nation. This idea, this essential nature of a constitutional republic. And he makes very clear to the Jews of the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island in 1790 that they are equal citizens and that religious liberty and conscience rights absolutely extends to them. By the way, he was pugnacious. Unlike Washington, he was a one-term president, as was his son. But look at the date. I commend this date to you from John Adams, our second president. And by the way, truly one of the most important scholars and thinkers of our Constitution. We have no government armed with power. By the way, you'll see some New England imagery here. And as a sailor, I am having plied those waters many times. I love Adams. He says, we have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion, avarice, ambition, revenge, gallantry, would break the strongest chords of our Constitution. Here's the New England man: as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other. By the way, I commend to you in this short passage the words only and holy. He was a very great litigator, probably the greatest litigator as president, as an equal with Abraham Lincoln. They would have been incredible in the courtroom together. And his use of language is extremely intentional. He means what he's saying here. One of the great triumvirate in the Senate where we worked, you can hardly believe that Calhoun, Webster, and Clay were all in the Senate at the same time. That's like Michelangelo, and Raphael, working in the same atelier, in Rome. But Webster, a great senator, a great advocate and lawyer in the United States Supreme Court. I think this take, as a senior statesman in two of our three branches, the religion which has introduced civil liberty is the religion of Christ and his apostles, which he says enjoins humility, piety, and benevolence, which acknowledges in every person a brother, sister, and a citizen with equal rights. Look what Webster says. This is genuine Christianity, and to this we owe our free constitutions of government. And he goes on to quote from Scripture and to talk about the practical application in the public square of Scripture. He doesn't mandate that to hold public office you have to be a Christian. In fact, our Constitution is clear that we have no religious test. But Webster makes it very clear that it is the unwritten Constitution, right? Ordered liberty in virtue, rooted in moral goodness, right? That allows, over time, a constitutional republic like ours to exist and to thrive. Again, coming up to Thanksgiving, both of these, I think, passages from Lincoln are very worthy. But I would direct you to the passage from his proclamation for a national day of prayer and fasting. I was at Gettysburg College last year, and one of my interlocutors suggested that Lincoln was not a Christian, he was not a religious man, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, we know that because we're all human beings, that in life, it's not how you begin, it's how you end. Lincoln obviously was assassinated on Good Friday, so he didn't have a very long life. But overwhelmingly, and Harold Holzer and Allen Galzo are Lincoln's most important living biographers. They both make it very clear in their work on Lincoln that his preoccupation by religion, by faith, by duty to the natural law was extremely strong by the end of his life. And look at this passage. He said, "It is fit and becoming in all people at all times to acknowledge and revere the supreme government of God, to bow in humble submission to his chastisement, to confess and deplore their sins and transgressions in the full conviction of the fear of the Lord as the beginning of wisdom, and to pray with all fervency and contrition for the pardon of their past offenses and for a blessing upon their present and prospective action." Now I am being hyperbolic. If any president issued that statement today, they might be impeached. It is a remarkably Christological, religion-soaked, in the best sense, by the way, a statement when he calls at one of the worst moments in American history. I mean, we are at the nadir when he issues this proclamation. And yet, this humble submission and through line of faith is absolutely unmissable. By the way, I'm a Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass Republican. This particular letter is representative of some of the sayings that we have from the founder of the Underground Railroad. And she says, God's time is always near. He set the North Star in the heavens. He gave me the strength in my limbs. He meant I should be free. She was a very serious evangelical Christian. I'm taking no licenses. And to understand her life, her biography, her mission, her legacy would be an act of erasure not to include her very serious faith in Christ. Douglass as well, we're speaking of great hairstyles. The life of a nation is secure only while the nation is honest, truthful, and virtuous. By the way, he was the most famous speaker, including Lincoln, the most famous speaker in mid-century, 19th century America, and spoke often of the connection, of the weaving overlap between faith and his public life, and what he saw as the greatest mission of the United States. Franklin Roosevelt, the only man who has been elected 4 times. I'm raising my right hand for the final time. I have read a number of biographies of Franklin Roosevelt. This is my view, strongly held, that the most important thing that every single one of Roosevelt's biographers miss is his faith. At Groton, at Harvard, in his life as governor of New York, 4 times as president, the most important, and I do mean this, the most important meeting with Winston Churchill, on the outside, of a naval ship, having a Sunday morning worship service together, the hymns that were chosen, the scripture that was read. If you look, and it's widely available, if you look at his burial ceremony at Hyde Park in New York, the Christian imagery. But the most important thing is Roosevelt's words. And I would argue his words connected to the Great Depression and his words connected to World War II, overwhelmingly Christological. I could give many examples. It's possible that these aren't even the best ones. But he says we're inspired by a faith that goes back through all the years to the first chapter of the book of Genesis. God created man in his own image. We on our side, this is interesting. He's choosing sides. We on our side are striving to be true to that divine heritage. What heritage is divine that he's speaking of? I think reasonable people here and in other places know what Roosevelt is speaking about. We on our side are, by the way, this was delivered on Epiphany immediately 1 month after Pearl Harbor. So Roosevelt, who is a wordsmith and silver-tongued and remarkably charismatic, he knows exactly what he is conveying, not only to the American people, but to the world about what we Americans believe. We on our side are striving to be true to that divine heritage. He says we are fighting, as our fathers have fought, to uphold the doctrine that all men are equal in the sight of God. By the way, I am taking a license here. Have you noticed, and I'm generalizing, which is dangerous, that the political class of 21st century America often will speak about and assert equality, as well they should, but often they leave out the part that is reflective of our founding fathers all through the 18th, 19th, and including the 20th century, that men are equal in the sight of God. This is very, very elemental in the American experience and really should not be left out. And his wife, probably the most well-known, progressive, highly progressive First Lady we have ever had, including, I would assert, former Senator Hillary Clinton. But Eleanor Roosevelt often would, and spoke and wrote often. She was a newspaper columnist. She was a speaker. She spoke in behalf of her husband very often. And the idea of the religious and faith-based nature of our republic makes a return appearance in her work often. And I thought this was particularly interesting in 1940. The moral basis, by the way, this is from an early book she did, The Moral Basis for Democracy. We may belong to any religion or to none, but we must acknowledge that the life of Christ was based on principles which are necessary to the development of a democratic state. And by the way, she's speaking there not of a democratic party, she's speaking of democracy. I am particularly taken, by the way, by Eisenhower, one of our few five-star generals, elected twice to the presidency, the Supreme Allied Commander in World War II. When he was elected, he was not baptized. And between his election in what we call the interregnum, before his inauguration, he went to catechetical training at National Presbyterian Church in Washington to bathe himself in the Christian faith. He formally converted and became baptized. And when he, on his first inaugural day, please watch it, I love YouTube, you can tap in and see that before he begins his speech, he actually says, "May we pause," and he summons the nation to prayer. And he says, "At such a time in history, we who are free must proclaim anew our faith. This faith is the abiding creed of our fathers. It is our faith in the deathless dignity of man, governed by eternal moral and natural laws. This faith defines our full view of life." And so on he goes. Look at this line. I think this is actually very prophetic and totally timely, topical, and relevant to this day, this very day in our national history. Remember, this is from 1953. Eisenhower says, "A people that values its privileges above its principles soon loses both." By the way, he had remarkable series of comments in 1955 for something called the Back to God Hour. This was very important in the 1950s. And in his time there, he speaks at length and eloquently about some of the things that I'm discussing today. Dr. King, like Abraham Lincoln, murdered at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. It was a very tough year for our country in 1968. The assassination of Bob Kennedy, the assassination of Dr. King, just a mere 5 years earlier, the assassination, we've had 4 presidents who were assassinated, of John Kennedy in November of 1963. It's impossible to understand the entire narrative of the civil rights movement, which frankly began in its contemporary iteration in the 1940s. But Dr. King, at length, and almost every single time that he appears in public, on television, on the radio, in almost any public forum, the idea of progressive Christianity is weaved heavily through his remarks. And I think this is very representative of King. He says, "I believe that standing up for the truth of God is the greatest thing in the world. This is the end of life. The end of life is not to be happy. The end of life is not to achieve pleasure and avoid pain. The end of life is to do the will of God, come what may." By the way, every single one of our most important social movements in the United States, the revolution itself, suffrage, abolition, prohibition, the civil rights movement, the pro-life movement, all have had, as different as they are, one big thing in common, and that is the narrative of faith and religion that runs predictably and rightly, I would argue, through them. Democrats and Republicans alike. Jimmy Carter, our only president who lived to be 100. Ours was the first society openly, he says, to define itself in terms of spirituality and of human liberty. There it is again. Human liberty, spirituality, and faith go together. It is that unique self-definition which has given us an exceptional appeal, but he says it also imposes a special obligation to take on these moral duties. I would argue that those moral duties, wrapped in a special obligation, is definitively and uniquely American. That our nation, from its founding, has been specifically called out of all of human history, providentially, to do important things. Ronald Reagan, freedom prospers when religion is vibrant and the rule of law under God is acknowledged. Without God, there is no virtue because there is no prompting of the conscience. Without God, there's a coarsening of society. Without God, democracy will not and cannot endure. If we ever forget we are one nation under God, then we will be a nation gone under. Very powerful, and I would argue, very representative of members of both political parties, members of both, and I don't like to use this word loosely, ideological, from progressive to conservative. We've had many, many political parties, almost too many to count. But the one thing from left to right that they have in common is this very deep connection between faith and public life. By the way, I was very honored to speak at the Theodore Roosevelt gathering in North Dakota last year, and I spoke at length about Theodore Roosevelt's faith. And I was reminding the people who were nice enough to hear me say a couple of words that when he ran on the Progressive Bull Moose Party, almost every time he finished a Christian hymn that everybody here, Onward Christian Soldiers, would know, he would often finish speaking by saying things like, we stand at Armageddon, right, and we battle for the Lord. This is very Theodore Roosevelt, but again, it's this common theme, mission, obligation that recurs over and over again. And by the way, Jewish and Christian, again, a great senator from the time when we were privileged to work in the Senate, Joe Lieberman. I won't go through and quote him at length, but please take my word for it that in this very famous passage from a speech he gave in 2011, this idea of the Judaic-Christian special nature of our country and exceptionalism is a really great exegesis. So I'll go back to the beginning, and eagerly, I will, instead of attempting to be Solomonic, I will happily answer or duck a few questions. Thank you all very much. And we can pretend we've all been best friends, so nobody needs to be shy, and if you're comfortable, I'd love to know your first name.
You gonna hold it? Okay, all right, I'm sorry. Hi, Tim, that was
Hello.
excellent. Thank you. That was terrific.
Thank you.
My name
I hope
is
I said
Mark.
something worth hearing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. My name is Mark. I would like you to comment on this thought that seems to be kind of in the middle between what you were talking about with the separation organizations and
Yes.
faith organizations. That, well, the founders were kind of deists. They believed in a higher power.
Right.
But there's really no connection to God explicitly,
Right.
which is not true. But how do you, I'm sure you've come across that argument before.
Yes.
How do you address that?
I'll tell you, there are great ways to address it, and I'm going to pick out one of them, which is that I was in a debate again just in the last month, And it was a quite hostile environment. I mean, not violent, I don't mean that, but it was, people felt very strongly that, that broadly speaking, that when it came to the public square, there was no role for religion. So that's the context. And one of the women, who was actually quite eloquent, brought up and read part of Thomas Jefferson's letter. And some of you, or all of you, may be aware that he wrote a very famous letter to the Baptist congregation in Danbury, Connecticut. And I mentioned Hugo Black earlier. This is, we think, one of the very first times, though probably not the first time, that the idea of a separation of church and state was popularly raised. And I went back to this publicly, to this woman, and I said, I'm very familiar with this letter, and I said, with all great respect, I think you're going to have to pick another item in your arsenal, verbal arsenal, because this letter is not going to do it. What Thomas Jefferson actually contextually says in this letter is not that faith and religion have no role in government. And by the way, he's quite clear about it. I think of all of our founders, I think he was actually the best popular writer. What he says is we need to make sure that government itself does not invade what is rightfully, as he says to the Danbury Baptists, into congregations like yours. Because the Baptists, hard to believe now, but the Baptists in Connecticut were quite concerned that government, the strong force of government, would actually ultimately impact the way they could worship and express themselves. And so, by the way, it's interesting in Jefferson, as I mentioned in this debate I'm telling you about, Jefferson himself on his own tombstone doesn't even list that he was president of the United States. He was very proud of the founding of the University of Virginia. He was very proud of being the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, but he only wrote one book, which is quite extraordinary. He had lots of books in him. He was a great reader, a great writer. It's surprising we only have one book by him. Maybe someday a historian will discover another manuscript. But the one book he wrote is on religious liberty in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And it makes that book serves as a leitmotif to the narrative of his Connecticut letter. So the way that I answer it is that there is no argument, in my opinion, no argument that faith and public life from the pre-founding to the founding to 3 seconds ago in the American experience don't go together, because they self-evidently do. That does not mean other things. We're not a theocracy. We don't have a national church. We don't have a national religious test. And indisputably, I think that there is a more aggressive secularization today, which is not unconstitutional, but it's not completely historical in the life of our country. I mean, not to that degree. That's how I would argue it. Does that answer your question? Okay, good. Yeah, great question. Thank you, Mark.
Hello, Tim. Thank you for being here. Wonderful presentation.
My pleasure.
My curiosity is looking forward, but perhaps you can reference the past in your perspective. It seems to me that a challenge that the United States is facing is the metastasization of other religions, non-Christian religions,
Yes.
perhaps in Minnesota, Michigan,
Indeed.
now in New York.
Indeed.
If the Constitution is for a moral and religious people,
Yes.
and it doesn't specify which religious people,
Right.
but implies,
Right.
as you've well presented,
Yes.
how should we look at that moving forward if certain states adopt their own religion within those states, perhaps, and being the command to not be unequally yoked and the division that may cause?
Yes.
Perhaps you can reference the Barbary Pirates challenge
Yes.
early on.
Yeah. There are a lot of ways to answer this really terrific question. And in fact, I'm going to be writing about this soon. Again, I love doing this, so I could do it for 15 hours. But I'll just pick out one example, if I may, which I think is particularly important, which is we're facing in our most famous city, New York City, the probable election in just a couple of weeks to the first Islamic mayor, or mayor who is of the Islamic faith, to lead this city. And we have certainly had mayors of Islamic faith leading other cities, here and internationally. London, I could go on and on and on. So my view, strongly held, is that in the political realm, we do ourselves less justice and value by focusing heavily on the intertwining of Islam and pick your topic. But I think we do far better, and I argue this very strongly, we do far better in talking about the practical application and making sure that our public figures tell us how the application of their faith relates to their policy. And by the way, we are Americans. You know, we fight in public, okay? And we are going to hear, and rightfully so, a lot about the topic I'm raising. We already have, we're going to hear a lot more. But I believe that the area that we currently have a vacuum in is for the responsible press and the cognoscenti to be very specific and to say to the mayor-elect, whatever, you know, et cetera, how does your faith relate directly to the policies that, you know, you intend for this city? Because in my opinion, from a very practical standpoint, that is ipso facto going to create a national debate overnight. Now, I'll tell you, the temptation is exactly the opposite, because we live in such a polarized time that it's going to be acceptable by large percentages of Americans that I can assert he's a communist, I can assert he's a Marxist, I can assert he is the Islam, whatever that would be. In my opinion, that does not serve the commonweal and the common good as much as drawing out the impact of that on the public square. It matters what Washington's faith was. It matters what Reagan's faith was. It matters what Rudolph Giuliani's faith was or wasn't. That matters. And I think more than ever, we need that discussion now. And by the way, I don't mind saying, not just in what we used to call the mainstream press, but left or right, we're not getting much of that. In fact, increasingly, it's considered acceptable to run for any level of public life and to never talk about issues of the spirit. And I think that that is a huge mistake. It's very important. I think it's the most important thing actually that there is. Yeah, and we're going to learn very soon what that means. By the way, one caveat, I'll use left and right. I think if you were to ask the political class, I'm going to set aside the general population for a moment, okay? And I'm being very parochial in kind of the swamp where I live, okay? If you ask the political class, Governor Newsom of California may run for the Democratic nomination, okay? And if you were to walk, let's say that every member of however you and I would define the political class were in this room. If you were to ask people, what can you tell me about Gavin Newsom's faith life? What can you tell me about his religion? I think mostly you would get completely blank stares. That was never as dangerous. That was never the case in the American experience. It really matters. So I think we have to draw out, in light of your terrific and rightfully concerning comments, we have to better define who they actually are. And I think who they actually are, in many ways, is much more important than what they promise they're going to do. Did that answer your question? Okay. Yes, did you have a question? By the way, kind of a question or kind of a comment is great, because I mostly don't like the phrase Q&A, because it pretends that you have all the questions and I have all the answers, and it's definitively not the case.
Well, getting back to the same question that he asked,
Yeah, sure.
it seems like there's been so much talk in the last, 20 years, I would say, about, I'll use me, I'm Catholic. So a political
Say again?
person.
You're
I'm
what?
a Catholic.
Yeah, sure.
So there's a politician running, he says, I'm a Catholic.
Mhm.
Well, how is that going to impact your
Yeah.
views on abortion?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I don't bring my
Uh-huh.
Catholicism
Uh-huh.
into my
Yeah.
public policy.
Great point.
And then there's the opposite,
Mhm.
when they're interviewing the Supreme Court judges we
Yes.
had recently,
Yes.
and they try to bring up the fact that they might have Catholic or Christian leanings.
Yes.
About,
Yes.
that's a disqualifying
Indeed.
statement.
Indeed.
So how do you?
So, yeah, I love this point. So I'm going to be bold in answering you. American Catholicism is no longer of a piece. I think there was a time, up to and including mid-century America in the 20th century, where you could talk broadly about the definition of American Catholicism as its practical application to policies in the public square. You could take urban Catholics from places like Philadelphia, Cleveland, and Los Angeles. You could take suburban Catholics, rural Catholics. I'm taking no licenses within the 40-yard lines. If you spoke to a group of 10, 11, 12 cardinals, and you were a president of the United States, they could mostly tell you their view of how American Catholics were going to vote or how they would reason a particular issue. That is gone with the wind. It no longer exists. American Catholicism, as it's defined by the beautiful way that you paradigmatically are phrasing this, does not exist. And similarly, you can no longer talk about American evangelicalism. You could recently, but you no longer can. It's not of a piece. There are far left-wing evangelicals, and there are far right-wing evangelicals. There are far left-wing Catholics, and by the way, there are large percentages of all the above. And there are a large percentage of American Catholics who have probably never, ever been asked or thought about how their own faith directly applies to many of the issues that you're asking about. That's not my opinion. When you look at the Pew surveys and many of the better concentrated surveys, what you find overwhelmingly, increasingly, is not because it's been imposed upon them, but many American Catholics simply are being acculturated and educated in a way that would be foreign to their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents. I think it's interesting, by the way, that we have a pope who is American, and we're only in October. You would think that this would be a massive, massive issue. And there is a time in the history of our country where if an American had ever become the pope, I mean, it would be in the political classes, of all Protestant, evangelical, Jewish, this would be a never-ending topic of conversation. But because of the elemental secularization of much of our public square, it's kind of here today and gone tomorrow. And it's interesting. I was at Catholic University of America and at Georgetown, and I thought this was going to be a really big topic. And it barely came up at all. And what was very interesting to me is that most people, to the degree that they want to talk about the new pope, they were mostly interested in whether he was a Chicago Cubs fan or a Chicago White Sox fan. Now, I'm a long-suffering cradle Chicago Cubs fan, right? And I think it's mildly interesting, but I think there's 5 million other reasons that having a pope that is American is far more interesting. But it's the time that we're in. One more? That's it? Okay, good. Thank you all very much. God bless.